Hi, and welcome to Coin Toss, the show where we respectfully and vigorously discuss the big questions within our modern, financialized, and increasingly tokenized world. I'm Levine, CoinDesk's managing editor of podcasts and your host. Today, I'm going one-on-one with arguably one of the most controversial people in Bitcoin, Roger Ver. Roger, welcome to the show.
Hey, hi, Adam. I haven't seen you with your new long hairdo, so nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's been a number of years, my friend, since we've talked. So, Roger, just to set things up, your story in Bitcoin started early, and it's certainly been one of the most controversial ones. In the kind of first days that I was starting to get involved with Bitcoin back in the 2012-2013 period, you were commonly referred to as Bitcoin Jesus, and I know plenty of people who got their very first Bitcoin from you. So, as an evangelist, sort of like sharing the information and kind of setting up, the markets that we see today and sort of the interest that we see today, you played a really pivotal role in those early days as sort of one of the people who was out there with your real name. Now, more recently, things have gotten controversial. A couple of years ago, we had the scaling debate, and basically you wound up splintering off, let's call it, although I know that that's also a controversial way to describe it, into the project that's now today known as Bitcoin Cash, with essentially a focus on payments. Today, I'd kind of like to dig into that viewpoint around payments versus savings now that we're a few years on, and we see sort of that Bitcoin is becoming a very investable asset for the rest of the world outside of our little niche. So to kind of start things off, can you just spend a couple of minutes explaining your philosophy about Bitcoin and how you see this phenomenon?
Yeah, I saw Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. I had the first established business to start accepting it as payments for our products way back in 2011. I put up billboards in Silicon Valley saying that we'll accept it as payment. I paid for radio ads on more than 100 radio stations across the United States saying that we will accept Bitcoin for payments. And this was way back in 2011. Today, Bitcoin is no longer being promoted as something that's useful for payments. So I feel like I didn't change anything. I'm still on the payment space, that I want peer-to-peer electronic cash for the world that everybody can use to buy or sell anything they want without permission from anybody. I think the controversial thing should be what happened to Bitcoin. Bitcoin, BTC, is no longer the version of Bitcoin that got people excited about it back in 2011. It's no longer even usable for any sort of reasonable size payment at this point. So I think the real controversy should be the censorship and the propaganda that went on within the Bitcoin community to basically force that change on a group of people that weren't interested in that at this point. And to this very day, our Bitcoin is still completely censored about that. And it's really disappointing. If Bitcoin was supposed to be a censorship-resistant money, why are they engaging in censorship of discussion about censorship-resistant money? And that's why I'm a big fan of Bitcoin Cash today, because it is censorship-resistant money and it has a community that supports free and open discussion of those ideas. So I don't think I changed at all. I think BTC changed.
I actually think that that's a fairly fair perspective to have, and I'm sure it's controversial for me to even say that. But I tend to agree with you. Kind of the early days of Bitcoin certainly was about the payments side of it, certainly, and the peer-to-peer nature of it. I think that we will talk about Bitcoin Cash, but just kind of to get into that debate, many people think that it's sort of about whether or not Bitcoin should be able to support larger transaction capacities. But in reality, the way that it appears to me is that it was an argument over what parts of decentralization are most important to something like Bitcoin at its early stage. On the one side, I believe that your position, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that it's more important that people be able to use the base layer Bitcoin, the actual Bitcoin protocol itself, to make payments of arbitrary, amounts of value between different people. On the other side, I believe that the position is that it's more important to ensure that the full nodes, which is one of the ways that normal participants keep effectively the miners and kind of the rest of the network honest, that the barrier to running one of those things is as low as possible and as many people can do it as possible. So can you kind of talk about that? How do you kind of weigh these various things? And why isn't sort of the side that you perhaps disagree with more important? Like what's the disconnect here?
Yeah, I think you got 2 points correct there, but there's a third point that I don't think people are taking into consideration. So the reason we want everybody to be able to run a full node is that adds additional censorship resistance to the Bitcoin network or Bitcoin Cash network. The reason we want everybody to be able to transact on chain is because that's the fastest, easiest, most reliable, most established way for people to use the currency. And that's, if you read the original Bitcoin.org website in 2011 or 12 or 13, that was the way it was going to scale to be money for the world. But a third point here is that the goal here, I think, on both sides of the scaling debate, we want a censorship-resistant something, right? We want it so that it can't be shut down or arbitrarily controlled by third parties. Well, one of the best ways to do that is to get mass adoption around the world. If Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash is used by 1 billion plus people around the world, it makes it much, much more difficult for governments to come in and demonize it or censor it or tell people they're not allowed to use it. If everybody's using it to buy, pet food to human food to everything else and pay their mortgage and their car payments and their car insurance, how can you stop that? Whereas if it's just a niche of small specialized people running full nodes on their computers at home, and maybe you have 1 million people around the world, it's much easier to demonize and much easier to shut down. And governments move slowly. The free market can move much faster. My goal was to get as much adoption for as many people around the world as quickly as possible so that Bitcoin basically became too big to be censored by the world. And at this point, the adoption is going, but it's certainly far, far, far behind where it would have been. We saw businesses like Microsoft and Expedia and Dell Computer literally stop accepting Bitcoin when the blocks became full on Bitcoin and the user experience became bad. If that hadn't happened, who knows where we'd be today? Everyone's excited because the price is, $55,000. Maybe it would have been $555,000 today if we hadn't run into that roadblock. And literally for the first time in Bitcoin history, we had reverse adoption. And that was just heartbreaking to see as someone who had pushed adoption so hard and so furiously for years and years.
You're clearly passionate about that side of the use case. Let me kind of argue the other point with you for a second. When you're talking about, that sort of use where you can support that type of use around the world, everyone using it for very small transactions arbitrarily without fees being high, it does seem like the burden of running one of those full nodes goes up substantially. I believe that one of the primary concerns around that sort of viewpoint is that if you are making it more challenging for people to run these full nodes, you are reducing the number, and basically you are making it so that businesses need to run them because businesses have an incentive to run them in order to do that. But businesses also exist within physical jurisdictions. They have to deal with governments, and as we've seen around the world, there are governments who have banned not necessarily Bitcoin effectively, but the ability for legal companies that have permission to operate there to use something like Bitcoin while retaining that legal use. So isn't there a contradiction there in sort of your point? Don't we need these nodes to be distributed and used by people as well as businesses? And what's kind of how does that sort out?
I think the contradiction there is that by limiting the block size, thinking that you're going to have more people running the full nodes around the world because the blocks are smaller. It's the exact opposite. Now that the blocks are limited to 1 megabyte on Bitcoin, as we're filming this, the average transaction fee on Bitcoin is more than $50. Right? That's a huge amount of money for most people in most of the world. Why on earth would you run a full node for a payment network that you can't even afford to use yourself directly? Whereas Bitcoin Cash, the payments are less than a penny. Sure, maybe I'll run a full node for something because I can actually afford to use it at less than a penny. Whereas $50 a transaction, why would I run a full node? I'm not going to use a payment network that charges me $50 a transaction. My bank will do it for less. PayPal will do it for less. Just about anybody will do it for less than Bitcoin at this point. And that's why we're seeing Bitcoin's overall market dominance going down, 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 month after month, year after year, because people are switching to other currencies that provide them with a better user experience. So if you want lots of people around the world and businesses running full nodes, the best way to do is to make sure that people continue to have a good user experience. And the other point of that, though, too, is if you read the original Bitcoin white paper, and the original Bitcoin.org, it was never intended for everybody to run a full node. They were supposed to use SPV wallets, which are tons of great ones out there that do that to this very day. So yeah, there it is on the screen. It's a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash, right? And you can do that right there. And only miners were going to be running full nodes. So it's really been a bait and switch in regards to what Bitcoin is. And so the coin with the ticker symbol BTC, yeah, it has the Bitcoin name, but if you read Bitcoin white papers, the definition of what Bitcoin is supposed to be, it's not BTC. It's something more akin to Bitcoin Cash at this point.
Now, so this episode was actually slated to be a debate between you and Pierre Rochard. It's what we kind of prepped for. It's what we were looking for. And I felt like that was kind of the best way to conduct this, right? With passionate sort of opinions on both sides and very kind of well-researched viewpoints. He canceled about 15 minutes before we were slated to start this. And so I'm talking with you directly. But I mean, it feels like people don't want to talk to you about this, Roger. Is that something you've come across, and kind of what's your take on that?
I'm curious to hear. Did he say why he canceled, or why did he agree in the first place if he was going to cancel later? So I don't know.
It was a bit of a surprise to us. Okay, so anyways, that's not a thing that you potentially find most often. All right, so let's talk about Bitcoin Cash for a minute. So I think that few dispute that you have the right to create a fork of Bitcoin and market it as that. I think that people take issue with you using Bitcoin.com as one of the ways that you promote that, although you do own it. So clearly you have the right to do that too. How do you feel about forks of Bitcoin broadly, and specifically, like, what was kind of the impetus to push down the Bitcoin Cash path rather than to stay with sort of the network consensus around what is commonly known as Bitcoin?
So to clarify one point, I had absolutely nothing to do with the creation of Bitcoin Cash, and I didn't switch to promoting Bitcoin Cash until after it had already been in existence for, I think, 3 or 4 months. But the impetus for that was there was a scaling attempt to allow Bitcoin to continue to be money for the world. It was called the SegWit 2x agreement, where SegWit, which is, if you're deep into crypto, you already know what that is. If not, don't worry about it. And the block size were going to be upgraded from 1 megabyte to 2 megabytes, which would, if you do both those things, you're going to get more than double as many transactions available on the Bitcoin network. If you do just the 1 megabyte to 2 megabyte, you double. Add SegWit, it's a little bit more on top of that. Anyhow, for whatever reason, the SegWit portion of that agreement was activated first. And then all of a sudden, everybody came out of the woodwork. A bunch of people that weren't running businesses. Bitcoin, the big block version of Bitcoin that eventually kind of became Bitcoin Cash, it had more hash rate, it had more businesses, it had more users, it had more community support, clearly, without any doubt whatsoever. But then all of a sudden, all these people that weren't running businesses, didn't have customers, didn't do much of anything other than be loud on the internet, came out there opposing the 2 megabyte upgrade to Bitcoin. And when that 2 megabyte upgrade eventually was aborted, I had to look around the world and say, okay, well, if I want a tool that can enable every human being on the planet to be able to send and receive any amount of money with any other human being on the planet, Bitcoin can't do that. It's not going to do that with 1 megabyte blocks. It's impossible for Bitcoin to do that. So there's a whole bunch of other cryptocurrencies out there. Which one do I think is the most likely to bring the most economic freedom to the most people around the world in the shortest amount of time? And I looked at all the different cryptocurrencies out there, and Bitcoin Cash was the one that was at the top of my list. Others were interesting, but I think Bitcoin Cash has the best shot at bringing the most economic freedom to the most people around the world right now today. And an example of that, if you're watching this and you've never used cryptocurrency ever before, it's impossible for you to get $1 of Bitcoin. You can't do it. The fees are too high on the network. It's impossible for you to even get $5 of Bitcoin because the fees are too high. But if you email me, Roger@bitcoin.com, I'm sorry, Roger@rogervier.com for this, I'll email you back $5 in Bitcoin Cash on chain. Impossible to do on Bitcoin. So that's an example. If you're brand new to cryptocurrency, you could never even get $5 of Bitcoin and hold it yourself. You'd have to use a custodian. But if you're using a custodian, why not just use your regular bank with dollars again? You're kind of right back where you started. So it's so incredibly important that people are able to transact directly with the cryptocurrency on chain, which means it has to have fast, cheap, reliable transactions. And the way to do that is to allow the block size to get as big as it needs to be, which is exactly what Satoshi Nakamoto said early on in his involvement in Bitcoin.
So I've been using the Lightning Network an increasing amount over the last couple of months. Technology long in development, intended to be built on top of Bitcoin and potentially other protocols, that allows you to use Bitcoin or something like it as sort of the settlement layer or the kind of source of truth, but to do kind of arbitrarily small transactions using something like the Lightning Network. Now, I believe you're correct about the on-chain nature of Bitcoin. It would be, let's just call it, inefficient to buy and receive $1 worth of Bitcoin at current prices, at current fees. But how does kind of the Lightning Network play into that? Do you not see that as a solution to this problem?
It's clearly not a solution to this problem. So to onboard a new person who's never used Bitcoin or Lightning ever before, it costs over $100 to do that right now today. A bank doesn't charge you $100 to open a new bank account. Why are you going to pay $100 to be able to just start using the Lightning Network? It's just absolutely ridiculous, and the user experience is atrocious every time I've tried to use it. And I'm curious to hear from you, Adam. If you met somebody who's never used crypto before and you wanted to get them involved in Lightning, what wallet would you tell them to get, and where would they begin? And what's the easiest way to do that?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge around Lightning right now is that you need to run a full node in order to actually participate on that network. But I've recently been experimenting with a project called Sphinx Chat, which effectively allows you to pay, I think it's $2 or $4 as a one-off payment and then they run a node for you, and then you can use the Lightning Network, and you get 2,000 or 4,000 Satoshis, which is obviously a lot less than the $4. But I mean, like I had the same problem, honestly, with Lightning for a really long time, and I've run full nodes, and we've set up tip things and things like that. But this most recent batch of technology actually does appear to be really quite usable. I'm not sure if you've checked it out yet, but again, like the idea of Lightning, streaming Satoshis via the Lightning Network while you're listening to a podcast to the podcaster is something that I think is starting to pick up steam. And again, as a podcaster, I think it's pretty cool.
As a podcaster, that's great. And I'm not familiar with Sphinx Chat or the name
Sphinx
there,
Chat,
but
yeah.
In order to pay them the $4 to set up your full node watchtower to watch your Lightning Network, are you going to pay them, you're going to pay $50 in Bitcoin fees to do that? How do you pay them the first $4 if you don't already have a Lightning Network?
Well, you pay with a credit card. That much is true.
Sounds awfully censorable to me.
So that's fair. All right, Roger. Well, I appreciate your time today. This has been Coin Toss. Stay tuned. Next up, we'll be having, coming up, we've got the hash at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. I'm Adam B. Levine, and until next week, keep the conversation going.